The 10,077th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Egypt, Sudan, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency Mr. Kamil El Tayeb Idris, Transitional Prime Minister of the Republic of the Sudan, and I request the Protocol Officer to escort him to his seat at the Council table. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Khalid Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. Ms. Eden Vosornu, Director of Operations and Advocacy, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and Mr. Cameron Hudson, Independent Analyst and Consultant on African Security, Governance, and Geopolitics. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I would like to remind everyone that this is an official meeting of the UN Security Council, being fully aware that today's briefing is not an easy one for anyone in the room. I would like to particularly remind all participants and speakers at today's discussion to engage in this meeting with utmost respect and to observe appropriate standards of tone, wording, and content in their remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Kiari.
Mr. President, since the Secretariat's last briefing on Sudan in October, the conflict has again intensified, confirming fears that the dry season will bring increased fighting and renewed attacks on civilians. Each passing day brings staggering levels of violence and destruction. Civilians are enduring immense and unimaginable suffering with no end in sight. In recent weeks, the conflict has centered in the Kordofan region, where the Rapid Support Forces have made significant territorial gains. On 1 December, the Rapid Support Forces captured Baba Nuza in West Kordofan, followed on 8 December by their capture of Heglig in South Kordofan, an oil field and critical processing station for South Sudanese crude oil pumped to Port Sudan for exportation. Kadugli and Diling, both in South Kordofan, are now under tightening siege conditions. Reports indicate that Sudanese armed forces personnel withdrew from Baba Nuza and Heglig into South Sudan, and that South Sudanese forces moved into Sudan to protect the Heglig oil infrastructure. Beyond Heglig, movements of armed groups across Sudan and South Sudan's border have been reported in both directions, with potentially destabilizing effects for both countries. These developments reflect the increasingly complex nature of the conflict and its expanding regional dimensions. If unaddressed, Sudan's neighbors could become embroiled in regional conflict in and around Sudan. Mr. President, for months, the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights has warned of the dangers of the escalation of hostilities in the Kordofan region and called for urgent action to prevent the repetition of atrocities documented in North Darfur and El Fasher in particular. A particularly alarming feature of the conflict is the growing use of indiscriminate drone strikes by both parties, which are causing significant civilian deaths. On 4 December, drone strikes in Kalogi, South Kordofan, hit a kindergarten and then the hospital where victims of the initial attacks had been taken for treatment. More than 100 people were killed in this despicable attack, including 63 children. On 13 December, drone attacks targeted the UN logistics base at the Joint Border Verification and Monitoring Mechanism headquarters in Kadugli, South Kordofan. 6 members of the Bangladeshi peacekeeping contingent serving with the United Nations Interim Security Force for ABA, UNISFA, were killed and 9 others injured. UNISFA has launched an investigation and is working to preserve evidence under challenging circumstances that would help identify those responsible. Due to prevailing insecurity, all UNISFA personnel are being evacuated from Kadugli until further notice. As the Secretary General has stressed, attacks targeting United Nations peacekeepers may constitute war crimes under international law and called for accountability. The safety and security of our peacekeepers is non-negotiable. In addition to the rise in civilian death toll, there are concerns about increasing cases of detention of civilians accused by one party of, quote, collaboration, end quote, with the opposing sides. In November, OHCHR documented that 93 civilians were arrested and detained in the Kordofan region for reasons of collaboration. Mr. President, the continuous supply of weapons, increasingly sophisticated and deadly, remains a key driver of the conflict. Sudan is saturated with arms. Calls to end these flows have gone unheeded, and there has been no accountability. Meanwhile, the parties remain unwilling to compromise or de-escalate. While they were able to stop fighting to preserve oil revenues, they have so far failed to do the same to protect their population. The backers of both sides must use their influence to help stop the slaughter, not to cause further devastation. Mr. President, preventing a further deterioration of the situation and preserving the unity and territorial integrity of Sudan requires swift and coordinated action. The Secretary General's personal envoy of Sudan, Ramtan Lamamra, is in contact with both warring parties to encourage them to engage in discussions on concrete and implementable measures to de-escalate violence and advance the protection of civilians in Sudan. Personal envoy Lamamra is engaging closely with members of the Quad. Consistent coordination of peace efforts is essential to increase our collective impact. Equally important is the deepening collaboration among the quintet of multilateral organizations, the African Union, European Union, IGAD, the League of Arab States, and the United Nations. Together, we are currently focused on supporting an African Union-led inter-Sudanese dialogue that can pave the way for a credible, inclusive, and civilian-led transition. To support these efforts, the Office of Personal Envoy Lamamra is developing a consensus document aimed to synthesize the visions put forward by Sudanese political actors and prominent individuals. The goal of this exercise is to identify convergences in views that can assist Sudanese stakeholders in shaping a credible political horizon. To foster complementarity and coordination of peace efforts, preparations are underway for the 5th consultative meeting on enhancing coordination of peace initiatives. The next meeting is expected to be held in Cairo, Egypt, in early 2026. Mr. President, as mediation efforts continue, the strong support of this Council is needed. With the conflict nearing the tragic milestone of 1,000 days, the Secretary General has renewed his call on the parties to agree on an immediate cessation of hostilities and to re-engage in talks toward a lasting ceasefire and an inclusive and Sudanese-owned political process. We urge the Council to send a clear, united message. Those who enable this war will be held accountable. We also look to the Council to use all the tools at its disposal to demand peace, protect civilians, and ensure accountability for violations of international law. The United Nations is fully committed to working with all international actors to end the violence and to support an inclusive path towards peace and security for the sake of people of Sudan and regional stability. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Eden Vosornu.
Thank you, Mr. President. As this catastrophic war nears the 1,000-day mark, its devastating toll on civilians continues to expand and intensify. The brutality of this conflict appears to have no bounds. The Kordofan states have emerged as a new epicenter, as you've heard, of violence and suffering, with attacks continuing, causing death, injury, destruction, and severely constraining humanitarian access. As you have heard from DPPA in South Kordofan State, more than 100 civilians were killed in drone strikes between 4 and 16 December, according to United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. This includes strikes on a kindergarten and a hospital in Kalogi on 4 December, which killed, again, at least 89 civilians, including 8 women and 43 children. Sieges around the towns of Kadugli and Diling have tightened, with deadly shelling and drone strikes continuing. As you've heard, a strike on the UNISFA logistics base in Kadugli on 13 December forced a temporary relocation of UN and INGO personnel from various locations in South Kordofan, including the 2 besieged towns. Despite widespread condemnation, attacks in the area further intensifies. On 14 December, a drone strike on a hospital in Diling reportedly killed at least 6 people, injured 12 others, including medical personnel. An interagency humanitarian team led by the humanitarian coordinator, Ms. Denise Brown, scheduled to arrive in Kadugli on 15 December, was unable to proceed due to the increasingly volatile and unpredictable situation. United Nations convoy did reach Diling and Kadugli in October, but faced very serious security challenges en route. In North Kordofan State, the situation has been equally alarming, with continuing attacks in and around the capital, El Obeid, and reports of forced recruitment of civilians being prevented from leaving the area as fighting closes in. A strike on a World Food Programme truck in North Kordofan on 5 December, in which a driver was seriously injured, was yet another demonstration of the grave risks humanitarian workers face across most of Sudan. This was the 6th attack, harming World Food Programme assets in Sudan this year alone. And in West Kordofan, we have also received reports of further displacement, including across the border with South Sudan, and of civilian casualties due to drone attacks following the takeover, as you've heard, of Heglig in the southern part of the state earlier this month. Last week, local authorities in White Nile State report some 1,600 new arrivals from Kordofan region in the city of Kosti, of whom the vast majority were children and women. Mr. President, staggering levels of humanitarian needs also persist across Darfur. Efforts to safely access El Fasher continue, with ongoing discussions on the deployment of a security assessment team. We continue to see new reports of serious violations of international humanitarian law during and after the takeover of El Fasher by rapid support forces, including mass killings and sexual violence. A report of our colleagues at the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights last week details some of the horrors inflicted on civilians in the area during the Rapid Support Forces' 3-day offensive on Zamzam displacement camp in April. Deliberate killings of civilians, gruesome sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, and the prolonged blocking of food, water, and the supplies essential for survival. Humanitarian responders in Tawila and Adaba and other areas are struggling to fully cover the needs of new arrivals from El Fasher, with resources and capacity severely stretched, despite new injections of funding from the Central Emergency Response Fund and the Sudan Humanitarian Fund. And while much of the focus of the Council's recent discussions has been on El Fasher and its surrounding areas, we must also highlight the very serious humanitarian situations in other parts of Darfur. Again, a drone strike on the town of Katila in South Darfur State earlier this month killed over 30 civilians and injured many more. Further civilian casualties were reported in another strike in the town of Kutum in North Darfur on the same day. Last week, the World Humanitarian Organization reported the large numbers of health workers detained in Niala, the capital of South Darfur. The World Health Organization has documented 65 attacks on health care in Sudan since January, with more than 1,600 people killed and 276 injured. The Adre crossing from eastern Chad remains indispensable to humanitarian operations across Darfur, and we therefore noted with great alarm reports of an alleged drone attack causing a large explosion in a nearby location in West Darfur on 7 December. Drones also continue to extend the reach of the fighting beyond Darfur and Kordofan region. Last Friday, multiple explosions were reported in Atbara in River Nile State due to drone strikes reportedly targeting power stations, triggering widespread blackouts in the area. We have teams in all these locations. Mr. President, this is OCHA's 10th briefing to the Security Council on Sudan this year. Month after month, we have highlighted deadly attacks against civilians, spiraling needs, and the complex array of impediments that delay or block efforts to reach the millions of people who require urgent, life-saving humanitarian support. We have urged the Council to use its collective influence and the full set of tools at its disposal to reduce the unacceptable risks civilians continue to face. We have pressed for de-escalation and peace. We have appealed for additional funding so that the local and international responders working in nearly impossible circumstances have the support and resources they need to deliver their work. But over the past year, we have seen yet more atrocities and a further hardening of the apparent impunity that fuels them. Increasingly sophisticated weaponry flowing into the country has caused the violence to spread further, deepening food insecurity and new areas falling into famine conditions. Additional waves of displaced civilians fleeing for their lives, including across borders, with broader regional destabilization effects growing. Humanitarian organizations being forced to cut back on life-saving programs just as the needs continue to grow. Relentless attacks on humanitarian personnel and health workers. Repeated targeting of essential infrastructure. Despite the challenges, Mr. President, the humanitarian response continues, with 16.8 million people receiving some form of humanitarian support since January this year alone. Our system is under unprecedented strain and increasingly under direct attack, but it continues to deliver. Mr. President, as the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Tom Fletcher said during his briefing to this Council in October, we need to find ways to act with greater courage and collective purpose in the face of this absolutely devastating crisis. We therefore renew our call for urgent concerted engagement and action along 3 tracks. First, on protection, the Security Council must send a strong, unequivocal message that attacks directed against civilians, indiscriminate attacks, sexual violence, and other shameless violations of the most basic tenets of international humanitarian law will not be tolerated. Women continue to carry a disproportionate share of this crisis. The Council cannot allow the horrors that unfolded in Al-Fasher, despite repeated warnings, to occur again in El Obeid, again in Kadugli, in Dilling, or elsewhere. You should please use your collective influence with the warring parties. Second, access. Humanitarian workers, including the local partners who remain at the forefront of our collective efforts, our dear humanitarian colleagues, must be able to do their work safely and without interference. We continue to strengthen the United Nations presence on the ground in all areas of need, including across the Darfur and Kordofan regions. We have colleagues in these locations. We do not feel safe. Our courageous teams need clearer guarantees so that they can operate safely. Life-saving humanitarian supplies need to flow freely via all necessary routes, whether across lines or borders. In this regard, I note our appreciation to the Sudanese and Chadian authorities for having kept the crucial Adre border crossing available for humanitarian movement. We renew our request that this authorization be extended indefinitely and that increased support for host communities and refugees in Chad and other areas continue, in other neighboring countries. And finally, peace. With another grim milestone in this nightmarish war approaching, renewed efforts are needed now more than ever to halt the fighting, to stop the arms flow that are fueling the conflict, and to move the parties towards the inclusive and lasting nationwide ceasefire that is so desperately needed. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Vosorno for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Cameron Hudson.